So I'm here with Dr. Poetry, also known as Robert Priest. And Robert Priest has performed poems and songs all over the world. His words have been debated in the legislature, posted in transit systems, quoted by politicians, turned into hit songs, published in textbooks and anthologies, and he's the author of 14 books of poetry, and he's won the Acorn People's Poetry Award for Mad Hand, and you've also put out work on CD as well.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So what was it that brought you to poetry in the first place?
Poetry brought me to poetry, I guess. I grew up in a household where my mom was a bit of a poet, and so she wrote poetry and recited poetry. And I one of the earliest pictures I have of me is my brother and I in her lap with a storybook. So I loved language and stories and stuff from a very early age, and stayed with me.
So you by a very early age, were you writing things when you were 6 or 14 or 8?
8.
Okay.
8 is when I recall writing my first poem.
Mm-hmm.
My initial ambition was more to be a children's writer, not specifically a poet, which I still have that ambition, still working on that ambition. And I wrote occasional poems as a kid, and up to when I was about 14 or 15, I got John Lennon's book, Spaniard in the Works, and which is I now see as a kind of prose poetry. And so at that point, I got more into satire and song lyrics. And then I think at some point I discovered, when I was around 20, I discovered, Irving Layton, Margaret Atwood, the Canadian poets, McEwen, Leonard Cohen, and the Beats, I think. And from there, the rest of them that I've got to so far. That fraction I've got to of the many, many, many poets that there are.
So you've taken poetry into a lot of different places, like out of books and into other places. Why do you do that? What's your interest in getting it off the page?
Well, I love it on the page. That's great. It just seems like the opportunities are there. We have, this flourishing reading system, thank you, government, arts councils, etc., and the spoken word movement, who've done it unofficially, which is a great thing. So the opportunities are there, and being as I am a songwriter, and I was inspired by the songwriters of the 60s, and you experienced that through your ears. That always seemed a viable route to go. And I had bands, and I was singing in bands, and I would just break into a poem, usually when something went wrong with the equipment. I was like, do a poem, So it sort of happened kind of almost like that, in terms of, not that I was anywhere near the first to do that kind of thing, but that's how I came to that sort of aspect of it.
So debated in the legislature, what was that about? Yeah.
That was in the Mike Harris era, and I had written a song about Mike Harris, and it was basically it was
a
called,
loving song.
A loving song, yes. It was called Free Ontario, and then the verses I basically played off the people's names, and I rhymed them in disgusting ways, like Paladini's a weenie and things like that. And it was just meant for a marching song, when we protested. And when the Harris government was trying to pass what they called their omnibus bill, the only resistance was to do a filibuster. So everybody was doing a filibuster, and as part of the filibuster, this guy, an NDP guy, Peter Cormus, got up and he said he wanted to apologize to me for having read previously my lyric in the House, and here's the lyric, and he recited it again. And the guy called a weenie was there, and it being a filibuster, you would have thought they'd just let it go, but they had to, is that proper? Is it proper to call me a weenie and all this? So that they actually extended the filibuster, and the sort of, there was a ruling which was, no, he's only quoting someone who called you a weenie. It was, to see grown men engaged with our government in such a way was hilarious.
So have you banned weenie as a word that can be used in the legislature? Or
no, it is still up for grabs, yes,
okay.
yes.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
yeah.
Fortunately.
I've seen you, the last time I saw you, you were singing songs and performing poems. You seem to have is that typical of the work you do, or are you doing both most places where you go? Or
I usually, if I'm invited to recite poetry, I usually finish up with a song or two. Not always, it depends on my mood. And I do gigs as a singer-songwriter. I'm not thrilled with my guitar playing, unfortunately. I wish I were better. I'm working at it. I used to do more with bands. So the economics of bands and dealing with the people of bands is a little bit more than I have energy for right now.
Also, you were doing a thing for kids this afternoon,
Yeah.
and you seem to be very interested in sort of literature and the younger generation. I was just wondering if people come up and ask you, what should I do to become a writer? How do I become a writer? How do you answer that kind of question?
Depends on how sardonic I'm feeling. I mean, really, I think the simple thing that I tell people is to do it, to read a lot and to write a lot, and that writing has a tendency to take you places and develop itself in a way. And then, you know, in addition to that, if you can get community around it, if you can find the other people so that you can share the work and maybe get some feedback. And I usually tell them that in my experience, there's loads of people who have the imagination to be good writers. And what the extra ingredient is just that must-do-it thing that certain people have. Because it's tough. It's not an easy thing to do. We're in a rich country. It's easier here than in a lot of countries. But it's still, you're not doing it for the big bucks usually. So I like to make them aware of that a little bit, you know.
So you're suggesting that they talk to a classmate or some other people and maybe get a circle of people who are...
Yeah, and of course these days you've got the internet, and so to find other people interested in what you are interested in isn't so difficult. Although, you know, the human sort of in the same room sort of thing can't be beat, but their ability to get community at this point is really amped by the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what about your current interests? What are you up to these days?
Well, there's sort of 4 projects in a sense that I work on by turns. One is this new book of children's poems, which is about heroes, but it's about people who've used nonviolence to change the world. And I've done a poem about Rosa Parks and one about Gandhi, and I want to do not just people who did it politically, I mean, because I want to do about Louis Armstrong, because I figure that's not too violent playing the trumpet, you know. So that's a project that I've begun. A book of poems for adults, let's say, that's got a backwards theme. I'm doing backwards Bible stories and doing exegesis
oh yeah, I've heard some of those. Those are fun.
Yeah, and looking at backwardness in general and applying backward techniques. So that's sort of got my interest. I think that book will be called Backward.
What was the toughest part of arriving at where you are now? What was the worst thing that you had to survive?
Like, you mean other than childhood or
high school or I don't know what? Yeah.
Gee, the toughest part. I think, really honestly, as an adult, the toughest thing is when you feel unappreciated and you don't have any money. And that comes and goes, you know, and part of it is just relative to your psychology and stuff, but part of it is that there's not a lot to go around. You know,
so you can be unappreciated and have money, or be appreciated and not have money.
Either one of those is sort of fine,
yeah.
And both of them, having both is really good, but having neither is that's a bit of a challenge.
And how do you survive that? How do you?
Well, some of it, you know, if you don't kill yourself, you stay alive, which is probably a good thing. I mean, ultimately, for me, I get to like, I like what I do. You know, like that's why I do it, and I think there's value in it, and I'm lucky to be able to do it at all. You know, so on a good day that will get me through it. You know, otherwise I can whine. I whine a lot. I try not to do it on camera, but you know, whining is good. Trashing people, I do that sometimes. People who do have stuff, but lately, you know, and partly I think it's partly through, you know, as you age, you hopefully scrape off a few of these nastier parts of yourself. And you know, I haven't had too much of that sort of downtime lately. So.